So while John gets his screen up, I'd just like to welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. These webinars have been inspired through by different conversations that we've had internally as an organization and with other partners. And as we continue to develop EQI and what it is, one of the things that we really decided to talk about was this notion, and you saw by the title, of like all the, we start our conversations and it's always about the things that are dividing us, the things that are divisive in our society. And then how do we, how do we use the protocol? I know we've talked about the protocol. How do we use the protocol to kind of begin to engage in these conversations in a way that to have sustaining change and to have impact. And so we thought, Eddie, John, and I were together one day, and we thought that it would be super helpful to actually just begin to have this conversation with the larger group and use the protocol as our tool to ground us. So that is what we hope to do today. John, do you want to add anything to that before we get started? And just so you know that the screen you're sharing is the presentation screen instead of just the, you're muted. There you go.
All right, there we go. How's that?
That's better. Thanks.
Perfect. I think I'm gonna switch this over here.
Sorry, normally we would have worked out these details, but we had a hard time getting in ourselves. So as you saw. Okay.
It's all good. Okay, we ready to roll, Nancy?
Yeah.
All right.
We are.
Well, it's always interesting kind of starting these conversations because there's so much, I think, of our own learning that we bring to the table. And so really what we want to do is just share some of that and engage you in some of that with us and create an environment where we can practice with this ourselves, but also engage a larger community in that. So Nancy mentioned just the UQI kind of focus, and I just kind of want to bring us back to that really we've talked about EQI being kind of like, if you think of intelligence on a continuum. So equity intelligence is, we're all at different parts on that continuum, if you will. And it's shaped by our experiences and kind of our set of, messaging, if you will, that we expose ourselves to today and what we've grown up with. And so as we've engaged in this, it's very interesting to kind of talk through that because we're processing through our own stuff as well. So this is really the journey. We talked about EQI being developed in the intersections. So places where people are together who maybe wouldn't be together had it not been for an intentional design to pull people together who have a different set of experiences through life. So one of the things that we've been talking about, one of the things I've noticed very strongly is that just in the climate that we're in today, there seems to be more and more of this pull to polarization, if you will. And it's a political piece, and we've all felt that. And it seems like it's getting stronger and stronger. And one of the things that's really bothered me is like, we're missing kind of the heart of the work. It's pulling us to division and arguments and pick a side and take a stand on one of these sides, but we're really missing kind of the true heart of the work and having some of these really tough discussions. And so that's really the space that we want to enter into today with this, is let's go there. Let's have some of these really tough discussions. And so I'm sure many of you have felt this piece before, that we're going to explore with perspectives. Nancy's going to talk a little about the RIR protocol. I'm going to share about that in a minute. But really our goal today is to really take a look at those first two steps, the recognize piece and then the interrupt piece. The recognize piece, we're really going to focus on the emotion that things bring up for you. And then the interrupt piece is really the processing through. How do we talk through, where does that come from? What set of experiences, what lines of thinking kind of inform that for you? And so we're going to use signs and symbols today as a way to do that. And so I just want to explore kind of the narratives that we have created around some of these symbols and some of the signs. And so this is going to be our journey, is looking at perspective. And how can we possibly be looking at the same thing and seeing it completely different? without getting into this place of like, you're right, I'm wrong. Let me get you onto my side so you can see this. It's really about kind of engaging people in the conversation. One of the things that I think has been frustrating in some of the conversations I've had is there's this feeling of like catering to the people who aren't ready for the conversation and kind of dancing around versus, going there and being bold and losing people or risk losing people. And so I want to kind of explore that balance a little bit, that if we're extremely divisive, we lose people engaging in this conversation of equity. So it's a journey. We want to pull you into that process with us today. Nancy mentioned this previously. Oops, we're going to use this today as kind of our guide, the Recognize, Interrupt, Repair Protocol, RIR. And so the recognize piece is going to be the emotion piece. We're going to practice with this in just a minute. What I'd like you to do is spend a minute just looking at this. I know it's kind of hard to read because the words are really tiny, but we've been using this a lot for a lot of connection activities and just asking people primarily to find more like the happy slice, if you will, because it's harder to find that given what we've been thrown in 2020. But what I'm going to ask you to do is utilize the whole wheel and really focus in on feelings, emotions that come up for you. And what I'm going to do is we're going to use Pull Everywhere as a way to kind of capture some of your feelings and some of your emotions that come up with some of these symbols and signs. It's anonymous, and so I'm going to, in just a minute in the chat field, I'm going to put a little link in there for you, and I'm going to ask you to respond with a word from this the wheel that resonates with you when I show you a set of pictures, okay? And so you'll go to open up another web browser. You can put multiple responses in there, and the way that this will display is a word cloud. So it's just basically going to cluster and grow as you see words that are more similar. But what we're trying to do is capture kind of diversity of feelings just within this group, that when you look at one set of symbols or one set of images, what that provokes in people, and then we can work on kind of processing that through the second part of this. So we'll use this wheel. Let me see here how I can do this. It kind of takes up both of my screens. Give me 1 second here.
Yeah, if you want, do you have the links already? Because I can put them in the chats if you text them to me.
I will. Let me get this over to you. Oops. Chat, I'll just put in the chat. I believe it's going to be the same link for both of them, just when I activate each poll.
Okay.
A little bit different.
Okay. And Marion, we will be sending this out. We actually have a tool at the end of this that we'll talk about, and we'll send the tool that includes this wheel as well.
All right, so there are just going to be 2 slides, and just do an individual non-audible. Go ahead and click on that link that's in the chat for you. And it should be active. Go ahead and enter that in there and start putting the words that kind of resonate with you in terms of feelings that come up.
And you can skip putting in your name. It asks you to put your name, but you don't have to. You can skip that.
Feel free to use 2, 3 entries if you'd like to. All right, and I'm going to switch over and just share some of the results with you with this first one. Let's see what pulls up for people. All right, last entry, I'm going to close it down in just a minute so we can focus on these. I think what I'd like for us to do is look at kind of the diversity of feelings that these one set of images provoke in us. And it looks like some of the words, if you were real two, they're split apart, but you see some people feel provoked by this. Some people feel courageous by looking at these. Some people are frustrated, disappointed, optimistic. Angry. Just screenshot that just a second there. And what I want to do is I'm going to switch back and show you another set and ask you to do the same thing, but now with a different set of pictures. So give me 1 second. I've got to clear this out on the Poll Everywhere side, and I'm going to ask you to respond again. Okay, use that same link and respond to these set of pictures.
John, we can't see the pictures.
Thanks, Dean. Let me see here what's going on. Are you able to see it now?
Yeah, I can see it now. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to switch over to the word cloud so you can see what's starting to come up. All right, about 10 seconds and I'm going to lock it so you can take a look at this collectively. All right. So what I noticed in this is that there's some overlap, two very polarizing set of pictures that have been extremely divisive. And we have some feelings that are the same. They pull up the same types of feelings for people. And some that are very, very different. And I think that the real challenge with this, Nancy's going to get into this a little bit more, is really focusing on these right here. What makes you feel disappointed when you look at this? What is it that's fearful about this when you look at these pictures? What is it that makes you feel excluded when you look at these pictures? And I think oftentimes we try to engage in the conversation to dissuade, like, how could you possibly feel that way? How could you possibly do this? Like, I can't believe I'm friends with someone who thinks that or believes that. And I think we lose people in the conversation. That just, it drives the nail a little further in terms of just the splitting and divisiveness. And so the RAL protocol is really kind of what we want to put forward as a way to really lean in and engage, regardless of how, you know, offended or offensive something seems to you. Is we've got to be able to enter the conversation. You know, there's one example that we were talking about, and there's someone who came in to do some work in Nancy's home and wearing, you know, a symbol similar to this and a set of words that for her really just kind of pushed on her. And instead of being really rigid and kind of in your face, it's like, hey, tell me more about that. Like, what's your journey with that? I'm interested to know kind of your story with that. And that really kind of impressed upon me a lot of skill and a lot of talent and a lot of patience to be able to do that. But at the same time, this individual is leaving with a perspective that he probably would never have gotten had Nancy not been the one to take that first step and engage him in a conversation that's a little bit deeper than just the symbol and the narrative that was built around it. I want to give a couple other examples too, and I'm just going to read through. I wrote down kind of 9 things that came up. I had a conversation with a friend of mine in the education space, very much about equity and for kids. And we just got really deep into a lot of these kind of divisive things. And so I'm going to read these to you, and then we're going to kind of move on in just a little bit. But these were some of the things that came up in that conversation, some beliefs that this person had. There's a massive indoctrination in K-12 and higher education that leans towards Marxism. Jumping into that equity and aligning with that philosophically is just something I'm not going to do. That came up in conversations. Okay. The word social justice is a trigger. It means complete social transformation, a transformation away from what this country was built on, the greatest freedoms, the greatest prosperity, the greatest opportunities. He felt like this work around equity, the larger equity work, is a threat to capitalism, and it moves socialism forward. And he obviously was ideologically opposed to that. I can get behind a focus on equitable opportunity and access, but not on equitable outcomes. Tell me more about that. What do you mean by that? Why are we not asking questions about other factors contributing to racial disparities, i.e. fatherless homes, conditioning culture of oppression from birth, Black abortions, Black overrepresentation with government assistance? So ironically, I feel some of the policies that were put into place to eradicate disparities are actually perpetuating disparities. And then 2 more. Black Lives Matter, the organization, carries a Marxist agenda which wants to completely dismantle everything that has to do with America and what makes it great. And then it was followed up with, if America's so bad, why is it that we have people who are wanting to immigrate to this country and be here to be free, right? So these are the types of things that I think oftentimes when some of us, when we hear those, we just want to cut it down. And so today I want to practice a little bit with, how do you engage? How do you not shy away from things that for you, these are not common comments in an equity space. In fact, they're often discouraged, like, how could you possibly bring that in the conversation? And so I wanted to just be real with this and kind of take us there. Let me switch back here, and then I'm going to pass this over to Nancy. Can you give me a thumbs up if you see the PowerPoint, just a big screen? Okay, want to make sure I'm in the right spot here.
Hey, John, somebody asked if the words on the graph, the larger they are, mean that those were more frequent.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. Yep, they're more frequently used. Yep, more representative of the group. And so what we have is, you know, we're including in here, kind of one of your takeaways are a bunch of pictures that could be provoking. We just used a few for that particular example. But what we're starting to see is that some of these symbols carry with it a narrative. And so if we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter, what that does is there's a narrative that's created around that has aligned us with some political affiliation. And so what's happening, I think, is people are not engaging in the conversation around Black Lives Matter because it's so polarizing politically. And so what we did is we started just looking at these pictures, and we said we could probably group these into kind of Republican-oriented versus Democrat-oriented types of pictures. And this is part of the polarization. And I'm truly convinced that there's a space kind of in the middle, if you will, where we can enter that conversation as humans and a focus on humanity without this regard to say, hey, I've got to kind of pick a camp, if you will. And so I know it's hard, but that's the push. And so one of the things I was challenged with was to kind of find what that space is, what that middle ground is. And so my go-to when I first started doing this earlier this week, I said, what's a unifying symbol? And this is the first thing that came to my mind. And I said, it took me about 2 seconds, and I'm like, that's not unifying, that's divisive. And I said, at what point did this become a divisive symbol for us, right? And so I texted Nancy and I said, hey, Nancy, if you were to use a unifying symbol, we've got enough symbols and signs that are polarizing. If you were to use a unifying symbol, what would that be? And it was like, cricket, cricket, cricket. And then all of a sudden she's like, well, my go-to is this one, the coexist. And then later she came back with, this is a new symbol that she's been using that's been kind of interesting because it pushes against kind of some of the white comfort, if you will, that's represented in kind of the first flag that you have. So my challenge to us is to really find kind of what is kind of that unifying symbol, what is that unifying language, where can we find common ground to enter the conversation without having to change your mind, without not liking you because you have a particular set of beliefs, but really about learning from each other. And that's really kind of the first step. So that's kind of the intro to what we're hoping to do today. There's a scenario. We're going to take one of those 9 towards the end and kind of put that into space, and let's all talk about it. Let's all have a conversation around it so we can practice some of the recognized pieces. When you hear a phrase like that, what does that bring up for you and why? Where does that come from? And not to correct it, but simply just to understand.
Thanks. So thanks for bringing us in that way. And it's hard to imagine the amount of conversation that we had to get to that place. And so this has also been powerful for us to kind of work through how do we engage in these conversations. I know that there's been, people are doing a lot of book clubs and doing things. And this was a quote that actually Eddie, he wasn't able to join us today because of a conflict, but he asked that we include, and because everyone's reading Kendi's work right now on how to be an anti-racist. And so this is a quote from the book. To be an anti-racist is to think nothing is behaviorally wrong or right, inferior or superior with any of the racial groups. Whenever the anti-racist sees individuals behaving positively or negatively, the anti-racist sees exactly that. Individuals behaving positively or negatively, not representatives of whole races. To be anti-racist is to de-racialize behavior, to remove the tattoo stereotype from every racialized body. Behavior is something humans do, not races do. So I don't know how many of you have read the book, but just maybe 1 or 2 thoughts about what this quote says to you. What is Kendi asking us to do, and is that possible, or how does it become possible? Because when I think of anti-racism, when I read this, it really, Jon and I were talking, I was like, this makes anti-racism an adjective and makes it an action, not a noun. It's not a person. You're not an anti-racist. You act in the anti-racist way, right? And so if it's an adjective and it's constantly in motion, what it means that we're always constantly doing it as opposed to becoming, right? So just maybe 1 or 2 people, if you could raise your hand or just unmute yourself, and what do you think when you read this? I can't see everybody, so you might just have to unmute.
Hi, this is Benet.
Hi, Benet.
I just finished his book yesterday morning, and what I see in this is something that you have to do all the time, because when you're raised in a racist society, you've kind of been conditioned to group people into categories, and you group them by race because that's a visual. And I think that me as a white woman, I am training myself to take away the thoughts of grouping people by their behavior or what they do or what they say by their race, that it's individual based on what that person knows or does. So that's my goal, and that's my way of working towards being an anti-racist. So
thank you, Benet. Maybe one more. Any thoughts that were triggered by this?
I'll share.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Therese. I have conflicting thoughts when I read that. I think it's great. I think ideologically, this is wonderful, but like experientially, or I think there's some times where we have to look at behavior and what people do and patterns of behavior to help people, right? Like, how do we have culture? Culture is a definition. It's how certain people, how they look, how they behave, how they think.
Mm-hmm.
So that how do we see where there are gaps and opportunities for kids and families and things like that if we don't look at not just individual behaviors or experiences, but we have to look at patterns, and there has to be some kind of grouping. So there's that part of my brain that says that, but then the other part of my brain completely gets this, that when there's almost like taking the judgment out of it, when I see someone doing something like Kendi said, that it's what they are doing. This is not, that's just what Black people do.
Right.
This is a poor choice that this person made.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree with it, but then as a sociologist, it is conflictual for me as well.
Yeah. And I appreciate that perspective, because, you know, this notion of, you know, how do we get to the root cause? You might have groups of people behaving in a certain way, but I think the simplicity of that is looking at, okay, these group of people are doing this, as opposed to really getting down to the root cause of what conditions have made it so that this is the behavior of this group of people. And I think that kind of speaks to your sociological brain in that, right? It's like, what conditions were there before that led this group of people? You know, why do poor people steal, or why do, you know what I mean? Some of those things like that. Totally. I see that. Thank you. Adam, go ahead.
Yeah, so I like the quote out of it. I have not read the book. I think a lot of what we're doing too is just battling our own brains as humans. And I think humans naturally like categorize things, and we teach our kids, you know, distinguish the capital letters from the lowercase letters, or put all the triangles over here and all the squares over here. We teach those things. Those are very important skills. But then I think when determining behavior, you have to separate out, okay, it's not the way that a person is acting is not because of the color of their skin. You have to dig deeper than those rudimentary things that your brain does.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you all for sharing. John, next. So we wanted to pull out, you know, we've been hearing a lot about critical race theory lately, probably more than we want to hear. And if people don't know about it, I'm sure that there's been some interest to find out, and specifically about whiteness as property, right? And we say that, you know, by the definition, it's been, you know, the way it's been turned back. So John, I could add, when you did that little list, I was thinking the little list I had in my mind of things that people have said. And one of them is that because whiteness as a property is a ploy, it's a Marxist ploy to say that owning property is bad, and nobody should own. It's a white ideology, and really the definition of whiteness as property in and of itself has been the ongoing legalized inability for people of color to actually own property, to actually be able to engage in ownership and the benefits of owning property, literally property. And so, you know, how do we see whiteness as property that started off as a physical thing of people of color specifically not being able to purchase property and build wealth, to what it's now become as this representation of what's normalized. So can you do the next slide, John? And so this persistence of whiteness as property is that we've made, you know, by definition, it talks about whiteness as a desired social identity. So as, you know, you see all the whitening gels, you see all the things that the closer to white, the brown paper bag test for Black people to get into sororities and things like that. This notion of the closer you are to white, the way you sound, the way you act, the way you dress, based on all those stereotypes, that somehow that you get it. And what we do is to maintain the subordination, is through creating identities for people of color, BIPOC groups to whenever you do identify with them, then there's a negative identity. And so one of the things we thought about this persistence was, and now it's not the case, but I remember growing up where Band-Aids were called flesh color, right? Except for it wasn't my flesh color. It was, you know, like kind of pink, and you all remember the original Band-Aid. It's now different now, it comes in everything. But this is that kind of notion of whiteness as property, when that is the desired norm and everything has to fit within it. So if you're outside of that, you're automatically excluded, right? John, another slide.
Nancy, I know you're going to go into some examples. I just want to add just a recent one. With our group, we had a marketing firm doing some work with us and like revising our vision statement and mission statement and values and all of that. And so we were trying to really kind of capture the heart of what we are. And so some suggested language that came back from the company, it started with the phrase unleashing the margins. And so we had a conversation around how does that sit with people? What does that convey in terms of the subordination, the culture of oppression type of a piece, right? And so it starts with an oppressive statement, which it kind of reinforces that, and then says, well, we're against that. And so one of the pieces that we talked about was we don't want to start with that, because it sends a message implicitly just through kind of the language that was used. So I think those are pieces when we talk about whiteness as property. It's not necessarily, I don't go to like property ownership per se, but those little markers that kind of maintain this distinction between good, bad, right, wrong, value, not valued. And it's harder, it's harder for me to see that because I don't live that, right, as much. And so I think part of that recognize and interrupt piece is just having an enhanced awareness of words like that, or like what you're going to go into here in just a minute.
Yeah, and I think, John, you speaking to that, the recognize is really the important part, is that because you have been so inundated with this conversation through your organization, through our collaboration, these are things that are now on your radar, but it didn't start off there. You know, I remember the conversations we had, 3-4 years ago, and they were different conversations. And so I think that's the biggest piece of anything that we do when we talk about trying to practice the protocol and to lean in when we really want to push back. It really is about practice, and we're not always going to get it right, but it's got to be this commitment to, like, if I'm committed to not being divisive myself, what does that look like in my actions, right? How does that show up? And so that's kind of what our commitment is. And I'm not saying I always do it correctly, but I'm always trying. It's always my focus. So we want to just show some examples of the persistence of whiteness in this form. And so this, we now know that this is now changed. They're now the Washington, what is it, football club, is it? But how long have we been trying to, and have indigenous communities been asking that we change their, they're not a mascot, but this notion that people can be used, and groups of people can be used for someone else's like pleasure, even if it's against their values and who they believe they are. So the Washington, they finally came to it, and we've seen other we're seeing, groups change their names and making them more collaborative than they've ever been before, but it's taking the pressure. And so this is the work that we have to do. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this cartoon, Charlie Brown, but I don't know if you realize that the only person sitting alone on the other side of the table, that this was actually planned, that the only way that he could sit at the table was if he was at the other side of the table. He could not sit with everybody else because that was crossing that color line. And so, we talk about this notion of color blindness, and that we say, well, I don't see color, but until we can acknowledge that everything that we have done in this country has been based in color, and we've sorted and filed people based on ability and color and gender, until we can acknowledge that, we can't get beyond it. Um, yeah, going backwards. Okay, and this was something that that we found last year. I think we all kind of saw it at the same time it came out. But you know, if you notice, be cool, follow the rules. And if you look at all the people who are not cool in this campaign, it's all the darker people. And I always wonder who would notice this if we weren't talking about it in this context, or is there something because of this deficit belief system and modeling that we've had for certain people that it just feeds into our beliefs? And this is that persistence of whiteness, is that the people of color, the cool kid are the white kids at the bottom, but the ones who are not cool are the ones breaking the rules are the brown and black kids. And what this does to reinforce this message, you know, and this divisiveness. And then this was actually taken out of a textbook in 2015, McGraw-Hill. The Atlantic slave trade between the 1500s and 1800s brought millions of workers from Africa to the southern United States to work on agricultural plantations. And so we can look at this, and this is what we're teaching our kids, and this notion that when you have this dissonance between, you know, they're talking about the slave trade, but they're talking about workers, which indicates that there was pay, that there was some kind of compensation, and what kind of message that sends for our kids to not understand the true history, and to understand when people are asking for reparations and reconciliation, why we can't understand that. And this is that dominant narrative kind of being perpetuated. So when we talk about whiteness as property, that's what we're talking about. This was a statement that was sent out from McGraw-Hill. We're deeply sorry that the caption was written this way. While the book was reviewed by many people inside and outside the company and was made available for public review, no one raised concerns about the caption, yet clearly something went wrong, and we must and will do better. So then my question is, who's at the table? If no one catches that, if no one looks, if no one who's reading and reviewing that, who's being invited to read and review? And I'm sitting in a conference right now. It's called WTF, the information, and it's a conference on tech, high tech women in CEO and high level C-level positions, and they're talking, you know, about who's not at the table, and the impact of underrepresentation and voices being missed, and literally the financial impact of that on their organizations. Here's another one. You probably have seen this, the H&M with the, you know, the coolest monkey in, I can't see that close. Oh, in the jungle. And you know, it's a black kid who's the coolest monkey. Again, a lot of outrage. And then there was a response by H&M. And here, we sincerely apologize for offending people with this image of a printed hooded top. And even in the statement, they're not even acknowledged. It's almost like this pushback, like it was simply a printed hooded top. What's the problem? The image has been removed from all online channels, and the product will not be for sale in the United States. So are we picking up the nuanced language here? So we're not going to sell it here. We actually don't think it's a problem, but we're going to basically placate you because you think it's a problem, right? We believe in diversity and inclusion. Oh, sorry, but you got the idea. And then this one, yeah, we believe in diversity and inclusion, and all that we do, we will be reviewing all of our internal policies accordingly to avoid any future issues. But again, when I read the statement, I'm not convinced, right? Because there's not really a true acknowledgement to what was problematic in the first place. And then we have the American Doll. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but Eddie brought this one up. The American Doll, Addie must leave her baby sister behind to escape slavery. Will her family ever be together again? And so when they came out with this line, they have all these dolls from all different races, and it was meant to be super inclusive, except for when you start reading the animations, you begin to realize that all the dolls of color have some kind of obstacle to overcome. It's got to be something difficult for them to do, except for the white doll, who actually just gets to be a part of a family, you know, and a beautiful family. And so this is how insidious it is in our society. And so when they talk about whiteness as property, as Jon said, it's moved away from this idea of actually property ownership rights, who was able to own and purchase property, even though that's still problematic today. But it's now moved into, you know, who gets to tell your story, and what is the story that's being told. So that moves us to the interrupt. So when we think about all these things, how do we interrupt? So you saw the changes, and even though, you know, some of them were better than others, the changes happened because people interrupted, because people stepped in and weren't willing to just accept this as the status quo. They wanted to see something different. So we're going to have an opportunity to practice interrupting ourselves. So this was, Jon read a few of these statements earlier, but this is the statement that we landed on. And actually, you know, we talked about doing breakout sessions and doing small groups, but we actually thought that today we'd like to do it in the large group. And in this instance, maybe ask for a volunteer who would like to kind of walk through the protocol with us on this topic.
So what I'd suggest we do, Nancy, is use, for those of you who can use the video feeds, let's do that as much as we can if you're in a place where you can do that. And let's unmute the mics and kind of jump in and engage in conversation. And I would say play to both sides of this. So some people might say this, or some people might respond with this type of a statement. I think sometimes in a space like this, it's like, well, can I say that? Do I say it? What will people think of me if I say something like that? Just put it out there. Some people are going to say that, you know, this is just not something I'm going to be able to get behind because it's, you know, Marxist related or what have you. So I just want to kind of free us up to be able to jump in and enter the conversation, because these are the real hard conversations, not just, you know, the pieces around kind of the common language. We're going to talk about colorblindness and deficit ideologies and poverty disciplining and microaggressions and things like that. Let's take it down a little bit deeper and figure out where some of this resistance and this polarization is coming from.
So with that, who would like to walk through with us on it?
Dun, dun,
Dun, dun, dun.
I will.
Okay, thank you so much. So, okay, there seems to be a mess. Oops. Is that me?
I'm not sure those.
Okay, all right. So I'll reread it. There seems to be a massive indoctrination effort in K-12 and higher education that leans towards Marxism. Engaging in equity work feels like an alignment with this philosophy. I just don't agree with that. So let's lean into it. When we start with the recognize, when you hear the statement, and I've lost you, is it Therese?
Yep, perfect.
Yeah. What feelings come up for you? Where are you?
I think the first feeling is confusion that comes up for me. My visceral response is probably what? Like, what do you mean? I would say confusion, and then frustration, and then probably third, understanding. Once I really get out of my feelings about it and think about what I know Marxism to be, then I think I can absolutely see why someone would say that.
Okay, so you went through this stage of kind of going through these levels of like reacting and then getting to a place of writing what I call an emotional wave, my language for sure, to this place of like, you know, possible understanding. So how would you interrupt? What would you, and when we think about interruption, I always think about when we talk about compassionate dialogue as it being strategy in literally trying to inquire, to have with compassion, so that you can, again, our whole premise is, how do we move away from something that's divisive? So if you would have responded with your first instinct, right, which is like, what? Like, what might that response had been to this person?
As far as interrupting?
Yes.
Okay, I would say, you know what? Let's hold on a second. Can you tell me what you mean? Because I really don't understand why you're saying that.
Okay, and that's actually a good inquiry, though, right? Because you're having a reaction, and that's okay, but you turned it right away into inquiry, right? You turned it into asking a question, and like, I really don't get it, so can you tell me what you mean by that? Which is an invitation for someone to be able to share their perspective, rather than you shutting them down. Because I don't know, I always say I'm a Sag and a fire horse, and when something kind of triggers me, my is like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, that might have been maybe more my response, right? Is like, and I know that I've had to, like, I'm sitting here going, I'm struggling with all this stuff that's coming down, because if I just feed into my initial response, that's where I go. I mean, this is where I go. It's like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, do your research, do your homework, right? And then after I get past that internally, then I can get to the place where you started. So you're far more advanced than me, Therese.
Well, you know, that's why I didn't volunteer. I'm probably a bad person to do this with, because I'm a teacher and I'm also a therapist, and I work with kids. I'm a school social worker. So I'm all about, like, stop, ask questions. I've practiced it to death. My sister calls me Harmony as my nickname because of my ability to pull people into these and stay engaged in these difficult conversations. Not that I do it perfectly by any stretch of the imagination. But that immediate response, if I feel that, I will express it, and then I'll kind of say, okay, I'm feeling some kind of way or whatever, or what do you mean by that? Or let's talk about it. Why do you think that?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Nancy, one of the things that you've kind of really impressed upon me with RAR is really to hone in on the feeling piece of it. And so I think an opportunity here is to say, you know, indoctrination is like a pretty heavy word. Like, what does that bring up for you? What do you feel with that? And I would anticipate words like, I feel threatened, I feel like overpowered or overtaken. And then I think there's an opportunity to dig deeper into, like, why do you think that is? Or where does that come from? Or what's threatening about, you know, this idea? What about the philosophy doesn't sit well with you? I think those are questions that continue to, like, open the door and peel back the layer, without trying to be like, you know, you are here and I need to get you over here, right, in terms of thinking, but just to understand what that brings up for people.
Yeah, and you know, I think that is also, it's super important, because one of the biggest that we talked about is that if you're entering the protocol with the intent, or the conversation with the intent of changing someone's mind, then you're already off track, right? It's not about, you know, for me, when I am ready to engage in this conversation right here, it's more about truly seeking to understand. It's not about changing someone's mind, or maybe expanding. You know, when we talk about repair, we talk about, you know, how do we create opportunities for a deeper learning or deeper understanding? Like, for instance, in response to 45's message around critical race theory, I'm doing a free webinar next week just defining critical race theory, because the truth is there. I can give you primary resources of the origin of critical race theory that contradict all this propaganda that's going on. And so sometimes it's just about, you know, but are you open to hear it? You know, are you willing to hear something that contradicts what you want to believe? Because people who buy into that could easily find out for themselves that that's not what it's about, right? Anyone else? What feelings come up for you who would like to share when you hear the statement? Who might want to walk through how they would interrupt it? Can we get one more volunteer?
I'll volunteer. So I think Therese and I are the ones that like to volunteer here more. I honestly, the indoctrination word was the one that kind of pushed my button a little bit. And then the second sentence, engaging in equity work feels like an alignment with this philosophy. So I'm trying to, I would want to know, like, what do you mean? I might ask them, I'm not sure I understand what you mean by indoctrination, you know, into Marxism. And then I might ask someone, like, you know, at first it's offensive to me, but then I would kind of move towards, what do you mean by aligns with this philosophy? I would want to understand what they're trying to say, because I don't agree with it, but I don't know why. I'm trying to understand why they believe this. So.
Right. No, thank you. Thank you. And that's it. I mean, as you can see too, it's like, if there is a curiosity, then it helps us lean in a little differently than when there's resentment or anger.
And I think you learn that as you go along our journey, that being like offended by people's comments sometimes doesn't get us someplace. It's sometimes better to try to seek to understand what they're communicating. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. John, go ahead. You want to do the next one?
Yeah, we have a couple more that we can use here. So another piece that came up in that same conversation, and just an opportunity to kind of lean in a little bit. While you're kind of processing and thinking of this, I'm just going to give a personal example of this to just kind of drive it a little bit more. So when I first was taught by Nancy on the RAR protocol, I internalized it as a personal thing first. I wasn't at the place where I could interrupt with someone else. I didn't feel comfortable doing that. And so I noticed just the recognize and interrupt piece on my own. And so I remember being in a newer community. I didn't recognize, surroundings and what have you. It was just new to me. And I was getting ready to go for a run. And I saw a couple, teenage guys coming down the other side of the road, and they were wearing what I would typically classify as something that looked like kind of gangster type clothes or whatever. And so my mind went to that categorization place of threat, not safe, keep an eye on them, like, be on guard, that type of a thing. And that was the first time that I caught like the recognize piece. Like, why did that spark fear? Why did that spark kind of hesitancy? And then what's the story? And this was the key for me, and the big turning point is, what's the story I want to tell myself around those guys? Because they're just a couple guys walking down the street, right? And we go back to kind of that behavior piece versus putting, these two guys in a bucket in terms of a set of behaviors. And so for me, it operated initially on a very personal level of just catching all of those pieces of like, why did I feel that way? And what's the story that I told myself? What was the default? And then what do I want to tell myself about, this person or these group of people? So just another example of kind of how that protocol operates on an internal space. But with this structural racism or institutional racism, this is something that's fabricated and just draws political lines. It's meant to sow division. There is no such thing as structural racism. What are some ways we can enter this dialogue?
So let's start with recognize. Maybe even if we could, even just in the chat, when you hear the statement, maybe just put down in the chat what feelings come up for you. That might be a good way for us to start. If you were to hear the statement directed at you, what feelings would come up for you? Anger and disbelief, astounded, frustration, anger, disbelief, shock. Yeah. So when you think about those feelings, again, the invitation for the interrupt is, we can't sit back any longer and let them pass, unless you are in fear for your physical safety, or, there's a lot of reasons why we don't interrupt. We've talked about them before, but if we know that we've got to take action, how could you interrupt this in a way that actually could help both of you grow and expand and deepen the relationship? What's something you could say or do And we'd love for someone just to unmute and just share what's a way you could enter this to interrupt this, but in a way that would open the dialogue.
I would simply ask, how do we explain the differences in education, incarceration rate, poverty levels between different groups if we don't, we have to either feel that it's some structures or that cause those differences, or that the people in those groups are inherently not as good. And usually I'm looked at and they'll say, oh, no, I don't think that Black people aren't as good or aren't as smart or are inherently deviant. Then they have to start looking to the structures and the institutions that cause those differences. So I just usually ask that question that makes them look at it differently.
Well, I'm going to push back a little bit, Cliff, and say, but what if Black people are just inherently bad? What do you say now?
So if the response is, well, Black people are inherently bad, at that point, I've never had that, Nancy. but, not that they didn't think it, but really they didn't say it. So, so thinking about it now, what would I have said? I'd say, you know, do you think I'm inherently bad? Because I'm not different, okay. You know, and so it would get down to that. And then we would talk about, you know, maybe some of the atrocities that all groups have done. How come these things seem to, you know, impact people of color? And then you also bring in poverty and talk about that. Sometimes from education helps that people understand a little more. But yeah, Nancy, that's never happened to me.
Well, see, but
I get it.
This is why we wanted to do it, though, because it's easy to think of you're talking to someone who's, you know, reasonable, who really has an interest to understand. But what if I just really believe that, you know, Black folks are inherently deviant, and maybe I'm afraid to tell you because you're a big Black guy, you know, but that's my belief. And so for us, I think that when we really think about interrupting, we have to also think about, what does it look like in the worst case scenario, right? What does it look like if like I said this and I am stuck in it? How do you engage and do it in a way with compassion? What kinds of questions can you ask to really get to a deeper understanding? You know, I always laugh when my husband and I get into it. I always like, who hurt you? You know, like when who hurt you, honey? Because there's something beneath it. And so are we interested to get beneath some of those beliefs, right?
So Nancy, I'd be really, really curious with that particular question. I said, I'm really curious about kind of where that came from. Is it like your experience of people who are Black that formed that for you? Is it friends who are Black? Is it stuff that you've seen on TV? Or like, tell me where that came from. Because I have a really different experience of people who are Black in that statement, right? So it's like, help me understand, but I'm not, you know, like taking you out right now.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. So Cliff, thank you, because you were I appreciate you stepping up and sharing that. And because I know you, I felt like I could push you a little bit. But I think that it's important to model, and that's what we wanted to do, because, you know, the one thing that I will say is the protocol does not guarantee a happy ending. And in fact, you know, someone quoted back to me, they're like, I always have to remember that you said that the protocol sometimes, you know, the repair is sometimes divorced. And that is sometimes you just can't reconcile, but it doesn't have to be done in a way that's full of hostility and anger. It could just be like this, we just don't connect, like our season or our time is over together, you know. And but engaging that way, as opposed to just shutting somebody out because they said this. And, you know, I want to know, especially if you're someone who I care about, I want to heal. I want to get to the bottom of this. I want to understand where it's coming from, because I treasure the relationship.
I think that's the key, Nancy. Sometimes if it's a distance person, someone you don't really respect or treasure, you can just write them off as being just another warped mind that has no idea what they're talking about, and write them off, or shrug it and just think, oh, they're just nuts, you know,
Right.
making it a crazy motion, or labeling them in that manner. You know,
The
and
problem is that they go off and they work with our kids though. Like these
Yeah.
but it's true. These are people that,
Yes.
you know, you don't connect. They're having an impact somewhere.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's what keeps me in it all the time, is that, you know, it's actually easier when it's people I love and care for, because there's a vested interest. But then I have to expand my interest to being, you know, if this person's going to go off and impact other people, what impact can I make? Can I make them just think something differently, maybe, or just expand or open their mind, so that maybe when it comes up again, there might be just a split second of something else, you know?
I think that whole division comes from closed-mindedness. And so if you're aiming to have them see your perspective, it's not going to work. But like you say, if you're going to ask them, help me understand this, because this does not resonate with me at all. I'm not seeing this fabrication. I'm not seeing necessarily the same things you are. And the indoctrination that came out of the last slide sounds like a brainwashing. What is the purpose behind that? Why are these political lines being drawn, and what is the motivation behind it? Is it to draw people together or to divide people? And if you hold this to be your truth, then at what point does your truth become a barrier to any other relationships that you're just not allowed to come into your life? How do you question that?
Yeah, no, that's good.
I wanted to add to that real quick. I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think the culture that's been created through social media is so much of that. I'm going to unfriend you. I'm going to not listen to you. Like I'm going to cut you off type of a thing. And I think we're losing people in engaging in the conversation to clarify and create kind of a better understanding. And so it really feels, you really have to fight that urge to just be like, I'm done with you. There's no more, right?
I would like to say something about that comment.
Yeah.
I think that this is Tony from San Diego. I think when somebody's saying that, they're talking about somebody else, and I would turn it onto that person and talk to them about when you applied for a job, somebody gave you an interview and gave you that job, and or you were admitted to this school, or you were able to buy this house in this neighborhood. And I would say, well, a Black person is applying for this job, and they were also well qualified for it, but they didn't get the interview, or they got the interview but they didn't get the job, or they applied for this school and they were well qualified to go to this school, but were denied for some reason. And the same thing with the neighborhood. I applied for a loan to get into this neighborhood, and I was denied for some reason. And this happens over and over and over again. So I want to explore his own experience and how institutions supported him in getting the job and the school and the neighborhood that he wanted.
Yeah, in the conversation, Tony, I totally hear that, and I just wonder, you know, when it comes down to being able, and this is where, you know, our ongoing learning has to be a priority, is that we have to be able to present data. You know, we have to present, or we have to be able to be willing to be vulnerable enough to get into these personal narratives, because when people really feel this way, like, you know, one thing, and I've had this conversation before as well, where, you know, I was in a session and we were doing Peggy McIntosh's white color line, you know, unpacking the knapsack of white privilege. And, you know, literally someone very, very angry at me because I'm standing over at 13 and he's at 125. And he's like, you know, we grew up poor, we had nothing. So for him, privilege was really about, you know, financial, security and privilege, and he couldn't get beyond that. And so it was a lot of conversation. It wasn't just one of understanding what it means, what privilege means in the context of McIntosh's work, right? And it's not just about, we can all be poor, but it goes down to opportunity, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have the opportunity to do something that I maybe can't. And according to the color line, I simply couldn't because I was a 13 and he was a 125. So there's things when we answer the same questions that in my life experience has been no or zero,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so we really have to figure out how to and be willing to engage in ongoing multiple things, because when someone feels like they have been oppressed themselves, it's really hard for them to see someone else's oppression.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I'll just say where this conversation actually went, where I engaged with him, was really around just tell me what you mean around structural racism. What does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
And then I just asked questions like, is it possible that an institution or an education system could have a set of policies or practices that create disparities? Yeah, and we landed on, there were some points of agreement. And we talked about how, tracking systems with different courses, the basic, college prep, advanced placement, who gets into those, what's the practice of putting kids into classes or identifying kids or creating exposure. That was something that he resonated with, right? And so we didn't land on like, all right, now we cleared this up, like you now think like I do. It was more just an exploration of what does this mean, and can you see that institutions can create kind of these disparities, if you will.
Yeah. And Jon, I love that question about like, is it possible? If you're ever at a loss, I think, is it possible that this could have happened once? Like, is it possible, that there's a time where the institution has not served all people equally? Is it possible? And I think when you do it that way, and for people to, incrementally, for them to get into the thinking that, well, it is possible, and I do know one experience. Well, is it possible then that there might be more than one, right? And that's another way to kind of enter into that conversation.
Or I can imagine in validating what they're saying, but can you imagine, and then moving it to both sides so that they can have all those statements. Although you may see this is also what we're looking at, so that you have more of a safety net to fall back upon, that nothing, everything, all, never, all those deep extremes are just too much, and they don't necessarily apply.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
All right. I'm looking down here. Nancy, I'm going to kind of defer to you. Do you want to I've got one more queued up if you want to do that, or we can jump into kind of next steps and focus on the next webinar.
Let's do the next steps, just because I think we got a good idea, but the resource, did you want to talk to them about the resource they're going to get?
Yeah, I believe, so the slide deck that we use in the very beginning with the signs and symbols and the polarization and the feelings wheel, we wanted to have you walk away with something like that you could use with other people, just engage in that process. Kia, where are you? Wave in there, Kia, there you are. Kia's queued up here to kind of help facilitate our next webinar, but she's also working with us at Collaborative Learning Solutions, just our internal team, to help process through some of those same things. So we're going to be going through similar activities and addressing some of the same things that we proposed here. Is how do we keep people engaged in the conversation? How do we all be about equity in education for kids and not have it be a polarizing piece? So we want you to have some tools to be able to do that. And if the signs and the symbols are a way to do that, it's an easy, ready-made slide deck for you. So I believe that's going out to participants afterwards through an email.
Yeah, so you'll have that. And our goal is that, you know, as we develop these is really to be able to have you walk away with something that you can use right away. Because we know that a lot of times, even though it seems like we have a ton of time on our hands, that probably all of you like us are sitting in front of the computer for your 100th, you know, Zoom meeting of the day, and, you know, all the things in homeschooling and all the things that are going on, that we really want to support the continuing of the conversations that we're having. So there's, you know, there's a few minutes left. Are there any questions or comments that anybody has? I want to, yeah.
You refer to RIR. What is that?
So RIR is the protocol that we use. It's based in the framework of compassionate dialogue, and what it stands for is what we just walked through. It's recognize, interrupt, and repair. And the idea is that instead of having conversations that are divisive, that we actually enter them with really seeking to understand each other and having a dialogue.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Not a question, but I did just want to share a comment really quickly as well, thank you guys for doing this. Jon said something a couple of times that really hit me and just has me thinking. And you commented a couple of times about when we're engaging in these conversations, the purpose is not to bring the other person over to our side of thinking, right? That's shouldn't be the end goal necessarily, more so than the curiosity of where it's coming from and the understanding, which I think is great. And it has me wondering for myself and maybe other people on here as well. When I get curious about where someone is coming from, I don't have a problem with asking questions. But when I feel that I haven't, now I understand where you are coming from. I don't need to be curious anymore, right? Like, I love the statement you said, well, what if they come back and say, well, yeah, because Black people are inherently bad, or they're unintelligent, they're stupid, they're dumb, whatever. When I come to the realization, oh, well, you are a racist, or you are whatever, like when I feel I have that understanding, where do we go from there? You know, and I'm realizing that for me, that would be tough. I'm open to having a conversation. I'm open to being curious and understanding, because understanding is the point that we meet at. But I don't know that I could, if it's something that to me is black and white like that, Black people are not inherently bad, I would have a very difficult time leaving that person in that space of conversation. You understand what I'm saying? Like, yeah. I understand now where you're coming from. We were able to engage in that space. It wasn't divisive. But if my goal is not necessarily to get you to see that that's not true, I don't know that for me personally that I wouldn't struggle with letting them stay in that space. So that's a good thinking point for me.
Yeah, and it is, and you know, it's a good thinking point for me too, because I think that the difference is when you enter a conversation trying to change someone's mind, then it's hard to listen, right? And so the interrupt really calls for us to inquire and seek to understand, because through that inquiry, we might get to the bottom of it a little bit. You know what I mean? Like, we might have a clear understanding of where it came from. And I wonder if I'm even being 100% truthful with myself, when I'm saying it's not about trying to change someone's mind, but I don't think it's about changing their mind as much for me as if I think that there's an opportunity to continue to open their mind, right? To expand a little bit beyond, that's where I stay engaged. And if I don't feel like there's any room for opening, but there's also means that there's room for opening for me too, right? So it's like talking to my plumber with the MAGA hat. Like, there was room for me to understand where he was coming from. I was told, I really wanted to understand what that meant to him. I wanted him to understand me, what that meant to me. And then for us to be able to talk about the dissonance of the messages, right, for that. But there would be a point that if truly there was no room for opening, then, like I said, repair is divorce. Like, there's also times where you have to sever the relationship. I had a friend that I love, and I still love. I was going to say loved, and I had to change it. I love him. I met him in college. We played sports together, and he was a significant impact in my life. And we stayed in touch, now almost 40 years. And about 5 years ago, I was that person. We were on Facebook, and he was trolling my page, and he kept going and saying hateful things, and I kept interrupting. I kept saying, you know what, I'm open. You don't have to agree with me or my statements, but you don't get to come to my page and be disrespectful to my friends or to people on my page because you don't like what they're saying. And I invited him in personal conversation. I texted him and I said, look, here's my number. Give me a call. Let's talk about this. But showing up like this on my page isn't okay. And finally, I had to block him. But when I wrote him, I was like, I want you to know that the reason I'm blocking you is not because we have different opinions. The reason I'm blocking you is because the way you show up is way too antagonistic, too harmful, and too divisive. And if he could have continued to show up in a place of kind of, constructive disequilibrium, then it would have been fine. So for me, like I'm never going to forget or minimize the impact he's had on my life, and those influential times in my life growing up, and things were kind of hard. But I also will not accept that kind of behavior from anyone.
Right.
So I think that the difference is, if there's a place for open, then I'm going to be more than likely willing to engage. But if they're closed off, there's just a time where the repair is, I got nothing else.
The boundary. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. That's good.
Yeah.
Thank you both. It's really good.
I kind of look at it at kind of similar to what you're saying, Therese, although that was sort of my words that came out of my mouth, mind you. But I also look at it from, I can only control my actions and my thoughts and my words. I can't control anyone else. So when I come into it, I think about it from the perspective of, I can respond to you differently. Or if I'm just tired of it all, especially if the response in back and forth has been really ugly, like Nancy was describing, I have unfriended because we cannot agree to disagree. And at that point, when it gets ugly, I don't want to be around ugly. It just makes me feel awful myself. And coming from a family that is of a mixed racially and mixed culturally, I mean, my mom Black, my dad white, my husband Latino. I mean, we've got my son married an Asian girl. So we're like, oh, we should be worldwide. I don't get it. I don't understand why people behave the way they do. And then I go back to the ABCs. What was the antecedent that they've experienced? And someone wrote in the chat, hurt people hurt others. And some people also keep people down so they can feel better about themselves. That's no good. Neither one of those experiences is going to come out with a feeling of generosity and kindness, and the humanity is missing. So I feel like I talk too much, though. I try to watch myself. Sorry.
No. I appreciate your voice, and I'll just add that I think that the difference is when we get to the repair is, how do we end it? How do we sever those relationships the same way we entered them, right? And so for me, I severed the relationship, but I told him. And I think too many times we stop at the interrupt and then we just cut people off, and then they don't actually have an understanding. So what we've done is we've reinforced that we can't have these conversations. So for me, when I cut him off, I literally gave him the invitation. I am always available to you offline. I'm always available to you to have these conversations, but it just isn't going to happen here. Right. And so that's a difference of repair. And it could have been, my repair could have also been like, you know what, we just will agree to disagree. And I like the way you approach it, but I still would have felt, for me, repair means like stepping back in and offering some sort of closure so that people can understand what, okay, we're not in this anymore, but I want you to be clear why. It's not because because what I don't want is for him to walk away and say, she's just a hard ass liberal and we just disagreed. And so that's why she cut me off, because that wasn't why I cut him off.
Right.
And so I don't want there to be any misunderstanding as to why we're not any longer in relationship this way. Yeah.
It's if I could just make one final comment with those scenarios, because those are real comments and a real conversation with someone who is a friend and a colleague. And so I kind of want to close it up. I think there's power in personal narratives. And I think that's at the heart of EQI, is being able to create space for people to interact, have those intersections, and to experience people in a way that they might not have if we hadn't intentionally created it. And so personal narratives are powerful, and I think it's because it focuses on impact. And so one of the things I've really appreciated, Nancy, a lot of your stories and examples, it's like, I understand the belief, but this is the impact that it has on me, or this is the impact that it has on kids. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in that space, because I don't think a lot of people wake up and want to, be horrible people. People want to do well. They want to be in relationship. We're hardwired for that. And so I think just the personal narrative and the focus on impact is huge. That particular person in that conversation is deeply committed to kids, is deeply committed to changing, disparities. In fact, he was very involved in changing some of those patterns of courses in terms of how kids access that. And I think that wouldn't have been something that most of us would have said, oh, this is a person who cares about equity. Mm-hmm. It's really kind of engaging a little bit more and understanding the impact of some of those beliefs and what that means for kids. So I appreciate you all kind of leaning in a little bit and engaging with us. By no means do I consider myself an expert in this area. I'm very much on a journey with you. I think I just want to be part of a community that is willing to lean in and engage and just grow. So,
yeah,
thank you.
And grow together. Thank you. So you'll be hearing from us tomorrow with probably a survey, and then the materials that Jon talked about from the beginning of this presentation. And we invite you to join us. We'll be doing this throughout the year as a build up to our Communities of Belonging event experience, which we still haven't decided will be virtual or face-to-face yet. But we wanted to just stay connected and truly build communities while we're trying to figure that out. So thank you for your time today. We are grateful. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cliff. Hey, Jon. Hey, Susan. You're muted, Jon.
I was gonna say, let's turn the recording off.
Oh yeah, let me.
Here. Record on, it's on your side, I think.
Yeah, let me turn it off here. I say that, I think Susan's got the recording because I don't have any controls. Susan. Oh, there we go. I just stopped. Okay, I had to, oops. It's still recording. I think Susan has the controls. You wanna just touch base offline?
Yeah, let's do it. We'll close it down. I'll
Okay.
give you a call.
Okay, bye.
Bye bye.